Welcome to the Pacesetter Pod, where we explore and reveal the perspectives, insights, and approaches to deliver great results and growth in your agribusiness through better execution. Here's your host, the Integration Pacesetter, Joe Mosier.
Welcome, Pacesetters of Agribusiness, to another episode of the Pacesetter Pod, where we amplify voices from across the agricultural industry. We aggregate those perspectives and work to elevate our collective thinking around strategy execution. I'm your host, Joe Mosier. You know, in the last 3 years that we've been doing this podcast, we've done several episodes that were intended to highlight the risks of poorly designed, poorly managed, and poorly resourced M&A integrations. Recent example would be in episode 126, we talked about de-risking M&A in your agribusiness, which of course has an integration component to it. In episode 101, we talked about articulating and activating your M&A integration strategy. So being able to clearly define it and then communicate it to others in a meaningful way, such that it gets traction and results in the business. Back in episode 73, we took a more cheeky angle, and we talked about 5 ways to ensure a miserable M&A integration, sort of trying to help you all do what you ought to do by highlighting what you ought not to do. And there's been, plenty more that we've done during the time. But as I look back at that, I think about some of the work that we're doing now, the transactions that we're supporting, the ones that we're observing in the marketplace, the ones we're hearing about anecdotally. There's something I think I might have been, maybe I've been getting it wrong, or maybe not wrong, but perhaps my thinking was at least incomplete on the matter. And it's so easy to default to catchy cold opens in a podcast. Things like, if I asked every person on your leadership team who has touched this deal to write down in one sentence why you're doing it, would I get the same answer? That's a leading question, where the obvious answer that I'm going for is no. It might also be an honest question, where if I ask that question in the wild, the answer would also be no. But from an integration perspective, that might not be, it's not irrelevant, but it might not be the great unlock that we want it to be. Yes, having a clear, shared, and repeated definition of why you're pursuing the deal is a great, bold step forward. And yes, it's a strong signal of organizational alignment, but it doesn't guarantee integration success. It's not that simple. So let's go back to this hypothetical, catchy cold open. A deal gets announced, leadership is excited, the press release goes out and it looks great. 6 months post-close, predictably the integration's behind, key people have left the organization, the synergies aren't materializing. And as you look at it, nobody's made an obviously bad decision, but somehow the organization is pulling in 3 different directions. And this is where I think I admit I've jumped the gun and maybe made a questionable assessment. And it's so easy to say that the diagnosis almost every single time is that there was never a shared, operationally grounded answer to why this deal creates value and why we're doing it. And that might always be there, but this might mistake the miss for the solution. What I'm trying to say here is you can have the shared vision of success and why you're doing the deal, but you also need to have an integration thesis concurrent with that. A clear line of thinking around how you are going to translate the notion of value creation from the transaction into the decisions that you make around the scope, the scale, and the pace of that integration. So I hope you see what I mean here. What I'm trying to get across is that having no sense of why you did the deal will surely set you up for trouble. But having a clear view on deal value doesn't preclude you from integration challenges either. And so today I want to talk about the role of an integration thesis. I want to kind of fill that gap in the thinking and the content that we've put out here so far. I want to talk about integration thesis not as a document, but as a discipline within the business, and one that I think agribusinesses, cooperatively held, privately held, or otherwise, really can't afford to skip. And we're going to do this in 4 parts. We're going to talk about what an integration thesis is. I want to talk about some thoughts around why I think the failure pattern of overlooking this part of the process exists and persists. We'll talk about how an integration thesis can look different across multiple different M&A deal types to help illustrate the point. And then, of course, as always, leave you with a few practical questions or tips that you can take away and apply in your business right away. Before we do that, thank you as always for subscribing and tuning in today. a quick reminder to like and subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcast. You can do it right now. It doesn't cost you a thing. And it's the best way you can support the show. And if you'd be so kind, we'd also love it if you consider leaving us a review and letting us know how we're doing. So to get started, let's clarify briefly what an integration thesis is and what it isn't. If I say integration thesis, it's not uncommon for folks to confuse it for things like the board deck around the deal rationale. Right? We've all seen those. This is not an integration thesis because the deal deck for the board it's too high level, it's too financially oriented, and it's not generally operationally grounded. Sometimes you can confuse integration thesis for the early synergy models, right? Problem is that early synergy models are often outputs without all the logic that's informed by facts on the ground. And it has a lot of assumptions made, but without owners that have actually built plans around delivering those synergies. So that's not a good fit. Some folks even look at the LOI itself as being the guidepost for the integration thesis. The problem is the LOI is more of a legal document. It's not really a strategic one. It's a way where it might have some signals as to the company you're buying. It's a poor proxy for saying what is integration success going to look like, and particularly how is integration success going to drive deal success. So what an integration thesis actually is that it's a set of explicitly developed and broadly held positions around how the integration is going to operationalize and deliver the expected deal value. I'll just say that again. That's my own definition. It's a set of explicitly developed and broadly held positions around how integration is going to operationalize and deliver the expected deal value. Those positions in the thesis can be captured really with three very simple questions that your leadership team should be able to answer in alignment. First one is, of course, back where we started. Why does this deal, or what value does this deal create? That's still a very important question, but what I opened with in the show today is it's incomplete. It doesn't provide the full picture. So, number one, what value does this deal create? Number two is, what has to be true operationally for that value to materialize? So we've said this is the value that's out there. Now, what has to be true in the business during and post integration to actually make that deal manifest, or that value manifest and materialize in the business such that it benefits the bottom line, it benefits the strategy, and you actually see it in your results? And then third and finally, what integration decisions follow from that? So if you know why the deal creates value, and you know what has to be true operationally for that value to materialize, the thesis starts to shape out the decisions that flow from that. Things around scope of integration, the operating model, the acquired company relative to the acquiring company, governance and decision rights. Over what time horizon does the integration need to occur? Right? Those are still pretty broad topics. They're not going to be enough to populate a detailed integration plan, but they help frame it up very well. And you get a sense of what it is you're actually trying to build. So before we move forward, I want to reiterate the point. Your thesis needs to reflect leadership alignment through these questions, but it should also drive consistent interpretability. And by this, I mean the thesis is interpretable the same way by multiple people. Your CFO reads it and they interpret it in a specific way. Your operations leader, who may or may not sit on the leadership team, they also read it and they interpret it in a similar way. Your HR director interprets it in a similar way. If these three people, as examples only, but if these three people would look at the integration thesis and they would prioritize different things when they think about how you're going to go about integrating the business, you don't have a thesis. You have more of an integration vibe. And this is the point. The integration thesis levels up the thinking. Your HR director, nor your operations director, nor your CFO should automatically, just by default, be only thinking about integration through their functional guide rails, their functional areas of accountability. They ought to look at that and say, okay, what does this mean for the company? What does this mean in terms of integration for this organization? And then distill down, what might that look like within my function? But that general interpretability needs to be shared. So if that's what an integration thesis is and isn't, why does the failure pattern of weak or non-existent integration theses persist? I don't want to just name problems. I'm hoping to diagnose some of them today. And the way we're going to try to do this is by breaking down several of the root causes behind the failure patterns that I've observed. So the first one is that, the first root cause I would say is that deal momentum crowds out strategic clarity. We've all been here. Once an LOI is being drafted, the organizational energy shifts entirely to getting the deal done, right? Not getting it done in the face of facts telling you shouldn't do it, but overall focus on deal diligence and closes is where the energy sink is. Legal, financial, operational diligence takes over. And the question of why can get kind of treated as already answered. We signed an LOI, right? Surely we know why we're doing this. It might have been answered when leadership decided to pursue the target. In the meeting, where leadership decided to make this recommendation to the board, and then when the board said, yes, we approve you pursuing this and putting forward the LOI and potentially putting capital at risk, then we decided, well, we already know why we did the deal. But the thing is that the decision to pursue the transaction and having a shared operational integration thesis are not the same thing. The momentum of the process becomes a substitute for the thinking around how you're going to actually carry that integration forward. And so deal momentum crowding out strategic clarity is a big problem and contributor to this. The second root cause that I observe is often, or not often, but at least half the time, the people who negotiate the deal aren't the people who are going to integrate it. And this is not a criticism. This is just a set of facts within a multi-leveled organization. Generally the CEO, the CFO, inside or outside counsel, they're going to drive the acquisition activities. The operations managers, the HR leads, the functional heads, the folks that are going to actually integrate or actually execute the integration are either not in the room or they're brought in a little bit later by design and by necessity, right? You keep a pretty small tent in the early part of the process. The challenge, of course, is that by the time they're involved, the deal structure is set, the price is locked, and any sort of integration thesis, if it exists, is whatever the deal team has sort of assumed. And so now the integration folks inherit those decisions that maybe weren't made based on, they inherit decisions they didn't make based on rationale that they didn't shape. And so we want to kind of push this conversation or push this idea of an integration thesis further upstream. So even if you have a small tent of people involved in those early stages of a transaction, they are still responsible for thinking about the integration thesis of the deal. Now, the third root cause, we've got 5 of them here. The third is that I've seen many times where financial framing dominates the strategic framing. Deals get evaluated through financial lenses. It could be EBITDA multiples. It could be, IRR. It could be the payback period. And those are necessary for sure, but they don't always answer the operational question. And a deal can look right financially and be strategically completely incoherent. In ag specifically, we're in an industry where a lot of value lives in the relationships. It lives in local market knowledge. It lives and nests in the operational trust and the inertia from people working together for many, many years together through many, many cycles and many, many one-off challenging situations and finding a way to work together, support one another, and prosper. And these are often things that don't show up cleanly on a balance sheet. And if financial framing is dominating strategic framing, that alone can leave some of the most important risks unexamined and some of the challenges of integration unimagined. And so the financial framing over strategic framing can be a real problem.
Poorly executed mergers and acquisitions destroy more value than they create. They can set your company back years. To defend your firm's position in the marketplace, you need access to the leading practices that unlock the greater potential of your people, processes, and systems. If you are undertaking a company transformation or pursuing an acquisition as a vehicle to grow, set up a call with Joe by visiting www.moshercg.com.
The fourth, and this is specific to co-ops, and I wouldn't say this is a headline risk, but I have seen it occur where the co-op governance structure just creates diffused accountability. You think about the multi-levels, the different layers of people that are involved. Of course, you have the board oversight, you have management execution, you have accountability to membership, which are also part of the board, and kind of so on and so forth. And so in a deal environment, it's easy for each layer to kind of assume that because we're all in this together, we kind of assume that other ones have done the strategic thinking, right? So very simply put, the board assumes that management has a plan, and management assumes that the board has blessed the strategy and are comfortable with the plans that have been presented. And in the gap there's a lot of daylight between what the board has assumed and what management has actually put together. And the result can be a deal that cleared every approval gate without anyone really asking about or owning the integration thesis. That is a challenge. And the fifth and final one is, the idea of we'll figure it out post close is just a cultural habit. I think probably for many industries, but very much so in our industry. In ag, we're operators, we're execution oriented by nature, right? We're good at solving problems in real time. Sometimes we probably enjoy it more than we ought to. You've heard the old adage that ag is an outdoor sport. You only get one shot on goal per year, and Mother Nature's the referee, right? So we live in uncertainty every year. We know how to get the job done. We just don't know which job we're going to have to get done today. And so that's a genuine strength in most contexts. It's something we should leverage and live on. But in M&A, it can become a liability because the problems that surface post-close are very, they're much more expensive to solve than the ones you could have anticipated earlier on. And so this cultural habit of figuring it out as we go, it really works well in the field. And it can work in integration, but only at great cost and disruption, most of which is preventable. So there's surely more root causes that we could examine, but I think this covers the lion's share of where most of us trip up and around why we don't have an integration thesis. And just a quick brief recap before we move forward. It was deal momentum crowds out strategic clarity. Deal negotiators and acquisition integrators are often a different cast of characters. Financial framing dominates strategic framing. Diffused accountability, especially heightened in cooperatives. And then we'll figure it out, make sure the deal gets done, and we'll do that work later. So let's step back from the failure analysis and talk for a few minutes about, maybe you're not convinced yet that the M&A integration thesis is actually all that compelling of an idea, or that it actually really solves any of these problems, or maybe it's just unclear. I want to talk for a few minutes about how assigning different M&A archetypes to transactions, sort of categorizing transactions, can be helpful in illustrating how an integration thesis can be radically different from one deal to the next. This has been particularly helpful for me in my thinking, and so hopefully it has a similar benefit to you. So I have 5 examples, not an exhaustive list, but it's a list I think that we can share with the goal being to show that each one implies different integration priorities. And this also demonstrates that you don't need to over-engineer this work to get it right. A little clarity can go a long way. So, first of 5, a scale thesis. So, a scale thesis is a deal where you're buying volume and you're pursuing value from combining the purchase power of 2 organizations, the operational scale and assets of 2 organizations, and you're absorbing some of the overhead in a way that can better drive earnings over a broader set of assets and customers and territories. The integration thesis behind scale is going to be integrate fast, standardize aggressively, and try to remove costs ruthlessly. If you do those 3 things, you integrate fast, you standardize, and you reduce costs, you're going to be delivering against a scale thesis transaction. Now, you might have a transaction type that's a capability-focused deal. Now you're buying something you don't have. You're buying a technology. You're buying a product line. You're buying agronomic expertise. You're getting access to licenses, something like that. Now, in that case, in the capability deal type, your thesis is going to be to protect and isolate what you bought. You actually don't want to absorb it too fast. Because it doesn't live native within your existing organization, it might not have a natural home, and trying to force the integration too quickly could actually break it in the process. And so with a capability deal, the thesis is protect and isolate, don't absorb too fast. We've also seen transactions that more have a geographic set of objectives, right? We're going to fill a territory. We're going to acquire origination density. We're going to enter into new territory where we have a compelling offer relative to the legacy competitors, and we're going to bring what we do to this territory. Now, the integration thesis there is to really think about local relationships and brand continuity and how those things matter a lot. That's why the business you're buying has that presence in that marketplace. So you will look for opportunities to integrate perhaps back office type activities, things that maybe don't touch the customers, don't face the marketplace, but you certainly don't want to centralize things too prematurely because you want to preserve the brand equity and the market felt presence from the existing customers. That's why you got in there. Perhaps you have an integration or an acquisition that is more of a vertical integration set of objectives. You want to control more of the supply chain. Simply put, you could be integrating upstream into your suppliers, be integrating downstream in terms of your channels and distribution. But if you're looking to control more of your supply chain, the integration thesis is going to be operational connectivity as the priority. You're going to look for logistics and systems integration to drive value. The things around branding, customer success, all of that's going to come later. You're trying to get operational connectivity because controlling a supply chain means information flows back and forth through the supply chain, sends the supply and demand signals appropriately, allows you to adjust capacity, focus, and utilization accordingly. So that's an integration thesis there. And then you might even have the classic defensive type acquisition, right? We're going to buy this business before a competitor does. It's perhaps not the most sexy or compelling. It's kind of fun to troll your competition, of course, but it is an archetype of M&A deals. It is something people do as a way to either advance or even establish and preserve their position in the marketplace. And with a defensive type deal, the integration thesis is you want to be honest that this is the driver. You know, we're just buying this to prevent someone else from owning it. And now what does that tell us about how we evaluate not just the price of the acquisition, but what is the integration urgency, right? Do we have to integrate this thing? If our main objective is to simply prevent someone else from being the owner, you know, the integration hurdles might be a lot lower to deliver the value. So here's the point. If you think about the scale thesis that we talked about at the beginning, where you're trying to integrate fast, standardize aggressively, and remove costs wherever you can, compared to a capability thesis where you're looking to protect and isolate what you bought and not absorb it too fast. If your team doesn't know which one you're operating under, some people are going to integrate fast and others are going to be looking to protect and preserve. Both of them are going to think they're doing the right thing, and you're going to have integration activities that are running in the opposite directions. And only some of them are going to be correct. And so I think that's where you just think about why you're doing the deal, what has to be true for it to materialize operationally, and then what decisions flow from that. Back at earlier in the episode, if you just think about your deal and these archetypes, and there's many more that we could discuss, it really helps bring this into focus. So what do you do with all this, right? If you're evaluating a potential acquisition right now, maybe you're out there, you're preparing a letter of intent, maybe you're already in active diligence. How do you apply this? And that's what I want to close out with today, is just some practical questions that you can wrestle with that are going to really significantly help you along the way. First, for a moment, just bear with me while I grab in my soapbox here. There's a strong argument to be made that in an ideal world, everything we just talked about should happen pre-LOI, pre-letter of intent. The thesis ought to exist before you sign because the LOI shapes everything downstream. The LOI often establishes the diligence scope, the deal structure, the earnout design, any retention packages, etc. And if you discover post-LOI that the capability you thought you were buying is just tied to two people who can leave the day after close, that changes the deal. It may prevent you from doing the deal, certainly, but it also, you benefit from knowing that before you sign, not after, because it also allows you to start thinking about integration as early as possible and forming that thesis. But in the real world, I know it's rare for this to happen so far upstream. We generally don't think about integration thesis before a buyer and seller have agreed to any sort of preliminary terms or entered in a period of exclusivity. So here's some practical questions that you can apply wherever you are in the process that ought to help. The first question is, as you listen today and you think about the transaction that you're pondering, pursuing, or getting close to closing, can you write down your integration thesis in 2 or 3 sentences? If you can't, then maybe all the way back to where we started, those expected deal values and objectives might not be clear enough. Second one is, as you write down that thesis in 2 or 3 sentences, would your CFO, your ops lead, your HR director, those examples we used earlier, or anybody else who's involved, would they all interpret those sentences the same way? If they wouldn't, then your M&A objectives, strategic, financial, and operational, maybe haven't been articulated and cascaded as effectively as they need to be. And maybe that integration thesis is suffering as a result of it. And then the last question, especially for those of you that are further along in the process, is does your diligence plan actually test the assumptions that your thesis depends on? Whether it's scale, capability, defensive, vertical integration, whatever it is. Does your diligence plan test those assumptions? And if it doesn't, what can you do now to course correct to the long-term benefit of you as the acquirer, the employees of the target company and your own, and above all, the customers that you serve? If the answer to any of these is no, that's the work that you should be doing before you move forward in the process. Meanwhile, always thinking about, okay, why do we do this transaction? What has to be true for the value to materialize? And what decisions does that shape for us? And how do we codify that in an integration thesis that's going to actually smooth the demand, reduce the disruption, and create the alignment and the conditions for success as we go into that post-close period? So in closing, this is all about driving better M&A results and helping you turn strategy into outcomes. It's what we do in our work. It's what we do in this show every single week. And your integration thesis, again, is a set of explicitly developed and broadly held positions around how integration is going to operationalize and deliver the value that you expected from your deal. If you cannot land on an integration thesis, that's a strategy problem. If you can envision one, but you don't have it, that's an execution problem, and you have a bit of work to do. If you don't, it's going to fester into an alignment problem, a communications problem, and ultimately a customers and market-facing problem that you absolutely do not want to do. The business will suffer. So please take some time thinking through this. Consider where your opportunities lie for improvement and what you might need to do to front-run the predictable issues of lackluster integration planning and lack of a thesis. And if you want to discuss this more or you think you might need some help in the process, you can always get in touch with me using the links in the show notes. Thank you for tuning in today and always. I sincerely appreciate you being part of the Pacesetter Pod community. And it means a lot to me that you take the time to listen in and consider what you can do to turn strategy into outcomes in your agribusiness. We're happy to be on this journey with you. So thanks again, and join us next week right here on the Pacesetter Pod.
This is thepodcastfactory.com.